One of the biggest emotional hurdles after or of betrayal is grief. Grief is pretty universal. One major difference between betrayal grief is that it is so personal. Today, I'm going to give you 12 steps in the grief process. Number one, recover from a loved one's betrayal requires more than time. If we allow ourselves the time and proper steps to mourn, we can gradually break grief's grip on us. Recognizing the role and value of the grieving process orients us to accepting the fact of the betrayal. Acceptance marks a major step towards recovery. And what we are mourning is the loss of the relationship we thought we had. If there's a separation, a split, or a divorce, then we're mourning the dreams or what could have been. How we mourn is relatively universal, but again, what we mourn is individual, which leads to my point number two. Grief is universal. Grievers are distinctive. Grieving, for the most part, follows a pattern, but each griever experiences it differently. Awareness of the basic pattern reveals common ground for mutual help and support. Recognition of uniqueness enables grievers to help themselves, and if your mourning is shared, it helps to guide sympathizers to what to say and what to do. One of the things that's difficult with especially betrayal grief is so many times you don't want to share it, or you can't share it, or the benefits of sharing it do not weigh the consequences, and so you do feel alone. And then people can't come to you because they have no idea what you're going through. Number three, shock initiates us into mourning. We go numb when someone we love betrays us. We feel stunned, almost as if we're in a trance. This trance-like state is nature's way of cushioning us against tragedy. The length and depth of the state varies according to our relationship, our past, and the circumstances surrounding betrayal. If you've had a lot of betrayal in your childhood, a lot of parental alienation, or what have you, you might take betrayal grief, or grief in general, a lot more difficult from somebody who had a much stable childhood and upbringing. But this trance-like shock actually allows us to absorb what's happened, and as we begin to adjust and get to deal with the grieving process. As the numbness wears off and acceptance grows, we regain control of the direction of our lives. And again, the process is universal, but how we deal with it is completely different from person to person. Number four, grief causes depression. Grievers typically, but in varying degrees, experience loneliness and depression. Being alone in what you're dealing with will not necessarily result in loneliness, however. Reaching out to others, and this could be friends, professionals, your creator here in this PBT community, is key to lessen loneliness and overcome depression. So that, human connectedness, human interaction can lessen our depression. Number five, grief is actually hazardous to our health. The mental and emotional upset of betrayal causes physical distress and vulnerability to illness. Grievers sometimes neglect healthy nourishment and exercise, which weakens our immune system. We also have a tendency to overindulge in drinking, smoking, medication. Not that I'm anti-medication. As a matter of fact, I'm a huge proponent for medication if it's needed. We might need a doctor's advice or a professional's advice to help us with all of this in terms of our symptoms and their causes, and certainly the treatment. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's more permanent. Again, depends from individual to individual. Number six, grievers need to know that they're completely normal. Betrayal by a loved one makes our future very uncertain. We might panic in the face of the unknown and fear what life will be like moving forward. Panic prevents concentration and defers acceptance of the reality of betrayal. And if we can't accept the reality of betrayal, it's hard for us to work on the steps of moving past it. It tempts us to run from life because all that avoiding and distracting and all that stuff. We might even think we're going crazy. Patience with ourselves and a willingness to accept help enables us to subdue panic and outgrow its confusion. So again, all of this is relatively normal, it's natural, it's universal. Don't think that you're alone. One of the things that adds to our sadness and depression is when we feel like we're alone in something. Number 7, grievers suffer guilt feelings. Many blame themselves after a loved one's betrayal for the betrayal itself or for the faults in the relationship that we may or may not have contributed. However, self-blame and guilt affects our mental health and impedes our recovery. Um, Close friends or trusted professionals, again, can aid in confronting and dealing with these guilt feelings, whether it's justified or exaggerated. And I say this because, we contribute to, maybe a relationship that doesn't have the best communication or doesn't have the best intimacy. Absolutely. But do we own anyone stepping outside of our written or unwritten contract within a relationship? Absolutely not. I heard one time that in order to feel guilt, it must accompany intent. So unless you intended on this certain outcome, you can't own guilt. So unless you wanted and intended your spouse to betray you, you can't own any guilt with that. And I don't really know anyone who intended or wanted their spouse to betray them. Number 8, grief makes people angry. This is a huge, huge one right here, especially because anger is really the manifestation of hurt, fear, and frustration. And because there's tremendous hurt, anger is a big one. People in grief naturally ask why him, why her, why me, why now, why like this? Most of these questions have no answers, which adds to the frustration. Frustration then causes us to feel resentment and anger. We want someone to blame. We want to blame God, ourselves, our parents, and certainly the one who betrayed us. If we can accept the lack of answers to why, we might begin to ask instead, what can we do now to go through, either together or apart, what has happened? Then we have started to move beyond anger and towards hope. This could be one of the longest stages or phases of grief. Number 9, emotional upheaval characterizes grievers. So a loved one's betrayal disrupts emotional balance. Oh my gosh, it sends it into a frenzy. The variety and intensity of feelings seems overwhelming. Other grievers and counselors can help us interpret and deal with these feelings. As we come to understand what we experience, we can find appropriate ways to ventilate our emotions and to channel them constructively. There's so much frustration with betrayal because in a lot of ways to us it doesn't make sense, and it's not going to make sense until you go through the process, and then it does make sense. And even when you think it does make sense, there's still a tremendous amount of unanswered questions. So again, if we can change the dialogue, change the narrative from why to how can I take this experience and do better, be better, become better. Number 10, grievers often lack direction and purpose. And let me just go back to number 9 for 1 second. Now, the person who betrayed needs to do all of that deep delving into why this happened, so he or she can, certainly look at the situation and address it so the betrayal doesn't ever repeat itself in the future. All right, number 10, grievers often lack direction and purpose. At times in the grieving process, a kind of drifting occurs. For those of us that have been betrayed, we often find familiar and necessary activities difficult. Even daily activities are difficult. I mean, I can't tell you how many days I spent in the fetal position in bed. And I had 2 young kids. So daily activities are like climbing, a mountain. We prefer to daydream about what was or fantasize about what might have been. I'm certainly guilty of that. If we can focus on appreciating the good of the past and begin to assess our potential for the future, this will establish a passing phase, not a permanent state. There's not going to be a tremendous amount of good that you could focus on from the past if somebody betrayed you. But hypothetically speaking, if you have children with somebody, some good did come out of that relationship, your children. If you built a business with somebody and now that's your livelihood, okay, some good came out of that. Or with a lot of people that do decide to work on the relationship, and let's just say their spouse had an addiction or they were just a philanderer or they're trying to meet an unmet need, that doesn't mean that every moment in between those times he or she met up with someone were not real. It just meant they fell. Again, not to excuse anyone's behavior for stepping outside of a relationship, completely inexcusable, but not everything was a lie or everything was, not real. Number 11, healing brings hope to grievers. It takes time, effort, and work, but gradually hope dawns for betrayed people. We learn to express emotions without embarrassment, shame, and guilt, etc. We learn to express emotions that are healthy, and eventually, some people can eventually express concern for their betrayer. Because let's face it, people that betray are lacking something. So if you take yourself emotionally outside of the situation, you can say, you know what, this person was hurting and they had an unmet need. They met it in the most gruesome, disgusting, unacceptable way, but nonetheless, they were missing something. It has nothing to do with me. And, I almost feel sorry for this person, for what they allowed themselves to do because they were hurting so much. We make decisions and assume responsibility for ourselves. The recovered griever helps us discover and develop our own potential. So, again, what we do out of betrayal is completely up to us. And we can really start a whole new life with whole new standards, with a whole new us. And lastly, number 12, survivors reaffirm themselves and choose life, which is what I was basically just saying. Eventually those betrayed recognize and embrace a healing truth. Grief has changed me, but it has not destroyed me. I've discovered new things about myself. I can build on strengths developed through adversity. I'm no longer my old self, but I'm still me. I face the future with confidence. Life is worth living because I have learned from this experience, and I can love and certainly be loved. I just want to say that there is a universal thought of the 5 stages of grief. They're anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and so forth. And they're usually, when you see these things, they're laid out nicely, like something like this. Okay, so this would be shock, whatever. This would be denial. This would be bargaining. This would be, sadness, anger, what have you. And then this would be acceptance. So each of these are a stage and a phase, denial, sadness, depression, shock, blah, blah, blah. But let's get real. This is grief. It doesn't come in stages and phases that you work through until acceptance, and then life is grand. This is grief right here. It's never, I shouldn't say never ending, but while you're going through these initial stages, it is a tightly wound ball of all of these stages and phases. And that's what gets so confusing. And that's why it's so important with time that you do the proper steps to undo this tightly wound ball, so you can deal more with the stages individually to get a grasp on it and to heal and move on in life. So we're all affected and handle grief differently. I told you that. And the key is to acknowledge and address each stage as they show up.